Most people don't know America created its own replacement by treating Canada like an enemy. Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the most consequential transfer of power in modern North American history was not the result of war, revolution, or economic collapse, but a series of decisions made in boardrooms and briefing rooms by men who believed they were negotiating from strength? And what if I told you that by the time those men understood what they had set in motion, the transformation was already complete? Not approaching, not underway, but finished? For over a century, the architecture of North American power rested on a single assumption so deeply embedded that it was never examined. Canada was the supplier. America was the market. Canada needed access to American consumers more than America needed Canadian commodities. Washington understood that dependency was a form of control, and for generations that control held. Empires rarely collapse from external pressure alone. They collapse when they mistake the patience of their partners for permanent submission. They collapse not from a single catastrophic error, but from a long sequence of decisions that each seemed reasonable in isolation, and together became irreversible. What happened between the United States and Canada beginning in 2025 is not a trade dispute. It is the moment a subordinate relationship ended, quietly, structurally, permanently, and the dominant power failed to recognize what it had lost until the loss was already recorded in infrastructure, in signed agreements, and in the memory of a people who decided they would never again accept subordination as the price of partnership. History has seen this pattern before. It never ends the way the dominant power expects. The United States did not simply impose tariffs on Canadian goods in February 2025. It classified Canadian aluminum and steel as threats to American national security under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act. Consider what that designation means, not as policy, but as signal. 8 decades of military alliance, shared intelligence, shared defense infrastructure, shared sacrifice across every major conflict of the 20th century. And Washington chose to classify the industrial output of that neighbor, that ally, as a security threat. The message was received with perfect clarity across Canada. You are not a partner, you are a resource, and resources do not have dignity. The assumption in Washington was that Canada would respond the way it always had: quiet protest, diplomatic delegations, and then, eventually, acceptance. Because 80 years of economic integration had made the relationship feel as permanent and inevitable as the border itself. That assumption was the fatal error. It failed to account for the one variable that transforms subordinate relationships into sovereign ones: the moment when the subordinate decides the cost of submission exceeds the cost of separation. That moment arrived in the spring of 2025, not in the form of a government declaration. It arrived in the behavior of ordinary Canadians making individual decisions that, in aggregate, became a national strategy. Travel to the United States collapsed. Cross-border shopping simply stopped. Not because Ottawa ordered it, because Canadians decided, collectively and without coordination, that the relationship on offer was no longer acceptable. This is how civilizational shifts begin, not with armies, with decisions made at the level of the household that accumulate into the permanent redirection of economic gravity. Mark Carney had guided Canada through the 2008 financial crisis as governor of the Bank of Canada, then became the first non-British governor of the Bank of England. He understood leverage. He understood the difference between the appearance of strength and its structural reality. And he understood something Washington had forgotten. The most durable form of power is not the power to punish. It is the power to be indispensable. Carney's response was not emotional. It was architectural. While Washington measured success in the language of pressure and concession, Ottawa began constructing the infrastructure of permanent independence: east-west trade corridors, critical minerals processing facilities, and the transformation of Churchill, Manitoba into a functioning deep-water Arctic port connected to the continental rail network. The geometry is precise. A cargo vessel traveling from Hamburg to Winnipeg saves over 6,000 kilometers by routing through Churchill rather than through American-controlled ports. 12 days of transit time, hundreds of thousands of dollars in fuel costs per voyage. That advantage does not compete with existing routes. It replaces them. When the first post-Panamax container ship docked at Churchill in September 2025, loaded with Canadian wheat bound for Germany, it was not a logistical milestone. It was a message written in steel and grain. North American trade no longer had to flow through American-controlled choke points. The monopoly that had shaped Canadian economic behavior for a century was broken. Comprehensive trade agreements with the European Union, bilateral arrangements with Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand, 700 million people, a combined GDP exceeding $4 trillion, a recalibrated relationship with China that positioned Canada as a pragmatic middle power, willing to trade with all parties while serving as proxy for none. Canadian companies maintained access to both American and Chinese markets simultaneously, while their American competitors were compelled to choose. Canadian exports to the European Union increased by 34% year over year. Exports to Asia rose 28%. Foreign investment in Canadian logistics infrastructure jumped over 300% in a single quarter. Global capital does not move on sentiment. It moves on structural assessment. And the structural assessment was unambiguous. Canada represented stability. The United States represented self-inflicted disruption. By December 2025, 147 American business leaders testified before the trade representative. They did not come to support the tariff policy. Ford cited over $1 billion in losses. General Motors closed 2 Michigan facilities. The Automotive Policy Council demonstrated that a single car part crosses the border an average of 7 times during production, and that taxing each crossing added over $1,000 to American manufactured vehicles. The dynamic resembled Smoot-Hawley, the 1930 legislation that triggered global trade contraction and deepened the Great Depression. Tariffs intended to protect domestic industry prompted trading partners to construct entirely new networks that bypassed the United States. Those networks, once built, did not dissolve when political conditions changed. They became permanent. The question is not whether a future American administration might offer better terms. The question is whether better terms, offered later, can undo infrastructure already built and trust already broken. Infrastructure is permanent. Trust, once broken between nations, recovers across generations, if it recovers at all. Canada supplies 4.3 million barrels of oil per day to the United States. Refineries in Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, and Wisconsin were built specifically to process Canadian heavy crude. When a 15% tariff was imposed on Canadian energy, the cost passed directly to consumers. By summer 2025, drivers in swing states were paying 41 cents more per gallon. Republican governors publicly broke with the administration. The James Bay geological formation in northern Quebec compounds this dependency. Confirmed by independent surveys, it contains concentrations of lithium, rare earth elements, cobalt, and graphite, the materials without which electric vehicles cannot be built and advanced military systems cannot function. The United States produces virtually none of these materials domestically. China controls the majority of global processing capacity. Canadian negotiators imposed domestic processing requirements. 60% of extracted minerals must be processed within Canadian territory before export. American defense contractors found themselves negotiating not as dominant partners, but as supplicants seeking access to materials their production systems cannot function without. Alberta's premier said it plainly. For too long, we were price takers with one customer. Today, we are price makers with options. When a hegemon mistakes the patience of its subordinates for permanent acceptance, it stops investing in the relationship. It relies on dependency to maintain compliance, and in doing so, it creates the conditions for its own displacement. Because the one thing dependency cannot survive is the construction of alternatives. Rome did not lose its Germanic frontier because Germanic forces were stronger. It lost it because Roman policy gave Germanic leaders every incentive to develop the capacity to function without Roman permission. Britain did not lose its position as the center of the Atlantic economy because American industry was inevitable. It lost it because British policy repeatedly failed to treat American interests as worthy of genuine accommodation, until American weight had grown beyond the point where British preferences could shape outcomes. Washington did not recognize the critical moment in 2025. The response to Canadian economic diversification was not accommodation, it was escalation. The assumption persisted that Canadian infrastructure investments were temporary negotiating positions. They were not negotiating positions. They were permanent infrastructure. The USMCA mandatory review approaching in July 2026 was conceived in Washington as a moment of American leverage. Internal Defense Department documents leaked in January 2026 revealed the administration's actual concern, that Canada had spent 18 months building the capacity to survive the negotiations' failure. Carney walks into that review with signed trade agreements, diversified export infrastructure, and alternative market arrangements that did not exist 18 months earlier. The United States walks in with a $1.6 trillion exposure if USMCA collapses, with manufacturers testifying to damage already sustained, and with a critical minerals dependency that military planners now describe as a strategic vulnerability. The leverage has inverted, not gradually, not partially, completely. The moment American structural dominance over Canada ended cannot be precisely dated. It was the moment when enough Canadian institutions and citizens redirected enough economic activity through enough alternative channels that the old architecture of dependency became insufficient to sustain the old architecture of compliance. That moment has passed. The automotive parts manufacturers that closed in the Mahoning Valley, force-setting 200 positions in communities already hollowed by deindustrialization, closed because Canadian inputs became too expensive and Canadian locations became too attractive. Some of those facilities are now being courted by Canadian investors. That is not irony. That is the mechanism of structural shift made visible at human scale. History does not punish intentions. It records outcomes. And the outcome of this sequence is already visible in the infrastructure built, the agreement signed, and the dependencies established. The quiet neighbor to the north built its own gravitational field, not through confrontation, through patient construction of alternatives that made the old dependency structurally unnecessary. America created its own replacement by treating its closest ally like an enemy. The replacement was already there, patient, resource-rich, and waiting for the moment when the cost of submission finally exceeded the cost of sovereignty. That moment came. The decision was made. The infrastructure was built. By the time this is understood clearly enough to enter mainstream discourse, it will no longer matter. The frameworks are established. The alternatives exist. The dependencies are structural. This is what irreversible looks like before people recognize it as irreversible. History does not wait for recognition. It only records what happened, and what those who were present failed until too late to understand.